Hi, Loani.
Hi, Kirsty. Nice to see you again after Screen Forever.
Yes, we've pushed back our monthly roundup a week so that we can capture all of the conversations that were being had at Screen Forever. And there was so much to talk about, wasn't there?
I feel like I walked away from this Screen Forever with my mind bursting in so many different directions. It was very fertile in ideas and conversation and different tension points in the industry. But I'm curious, Kirsty, what were the big takeaways for you from Screen Forever?
I feel like it's all the things that have been bubbling under the surface for the last couple of years, and they're at a point where we need to take them really seriously. So there were conversations happening both on stage and in the lunch line that really brought a lot of that tension to a head.
Yeah, I agree. Compared to last Screen Forever, where I think it was a little bit tentative and speculative about what was really going on, and there was so much focus on quota. Now we've sort of hurdled over that, and we're facing the reality of our industries. Much like you, I think I went to a couple of sessions, but where I really got insight was in all of those lunch queues and those water cooler moments with people talking about what economy we're in. So I heard lots of talk about being a service economy and how do we move out of that without losing our livelihood, but also how do we find a way to start not only telling more Australian stories, but keeping ownership of those stories. And then obviously that ties into issues or concerns around what is our national identity and what stories are we really trying to tell. And I always find those conversations super, super interesting. Everybody was talking. Everybody was active in conversation in the lunch line. It was great.
And it feels like a moment where, as an industry, we really need that transparency and we really need to be having those conversations. It can't just be put on a brave face, pretend everything's okay anymore. We really need to be having these conversations in order to move forward and set where our future is going to be, because there is a real tension and a real risk now that Australia could be left behind and we could end up without a national voice on screen.
And that's the discomfort that we need to be in, right, for any change to happen. I'm just curious about where all the money comes from. Where's our greater pool of money, particularly in that conversation around how do we Australia is doing pretty well at being a service provider for all of those inbounds, but we also know that there's competitors in that market providing incentives and production hubs and facilities and services. So how sustainable is that? But then if we're looking at also building an industry that starts to own our IP so we can reinvest that into our stories, where does the money come from to sort of fill that gap in a finance fund, fill that international piece?
Yeah, I was moderating the Producer Skillset 2030 panel, which is based on some research done by Donna Andrews through Afters. And that was really about what does it take to be a producer. But the underlying question was, where does the money come from? There's a particular pie that exists through the structure that we have in the industry in this country at the moment, where there is a scarcity in terms of number of commissions or amount of government funding that's available. And so we either have to grow the pie or we have to reduce what we're spending on individual productions, is the reality that it comes down to. But there was a fantastic private investment panel the next day, and we got a preview of Screen Australia's new private investment toolkit, which has been put together by Ian Murray and the team at 113 Partners. And the moment it came up on screen, there was an audible gasp from the room. Everybody is going to be using it. And its goal is really to decrease the friction of producers being able to talk to investors in their language, and for investors to be able to understand what it means to invest in a film project and what that structure looks like in the waterfall. So, yeah, I think private investment is something that we all need to lean into in order to fill that gap. It is something that, as a producer, is just another thing to take on, and we've seen even with our episodes with Darren Smith that he's gone from being a physical producer to more of a fund manager in trying to raise that investment. So I think there are going to need to be some structural changes around that. There was a push from the panelists on that producer skill set panel about bigger companies, not the little cottage industry, 1 to 3 people running a production company anymore, because scale alleviates that risk and gives you more resources to be able to pursue things like investment. And from the sounds of it, the money is there. It's just about making the proposition of Australian film like a likely opportunity for investors, which is hard. And there's other structural things that sit around that, like, are Australians going to the cinemas? How are we investing in the marketing of our films? everything is one big ecosystem that weaves together, and one shift in one area is not going to solve what's happening in the industry. But there's so many individuals doing fantastic work in their own little lanes, and we need to bring together the private investment conversation and the distribution conversation and the development conversation and the production conversation and the skills conversation, they all fit together.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I've ever heard ecosystem more at a conference than I did at Screen Forever this year. But we're all in this one ecosystem, and one thing shifts and we need to be cognizant of that and the impact of that. And Tony Ayres called it out really beautifully on a panel where he identified that the panelists weren't the future of the screen industry, but that emerging sector were. And if we don't keep them in mind as part of that ecosystem, we're at risk of losing the future of our screen industry. So to keep elevating talent, keep finding ways to do that. But just to your point about we need scale. There's lots of conversations about what happens to the missing middle. And I'd be curious from your perspective as a producer, those mid-sized companies who aren't quite at that point of elevating up so they can take on that risk capacity. Because there was so much conversation about producers in that emerging to middle band feeling like they might be falling off or might be falling out of that ecosystem.
Well, I think that's a good one to go back to in our conversation with David Court from a couple of weeks ago. If anyone hasn't listened to that episode, it's essentially all about right-sizing your company within the current landscape and whether you go big or go small or start thinking somewhere in between. But I also realized being at Screen Forever, I think there's such an assumption about what the term industry actually means from a definition perspective. And so many of the conversations are focused on the high end of town, the big broadcast commissions or the international commissions. And the reality is that our industry is far greater than that. It's not just the binary of international production versus small, scrappy creator economy. There is a whole range, and I think we need to really start thinking about ourselves more as a spectrum and thinking about what the opportunities are for us as individuals rather than trying to go, I fit in this box or I fit in this box. Thinking about, as we've often talked about on this podcast, the different ways to revenue stack and find ways of keeping yourself afloat. And there's so many interesting business models out there. There's people that have service arms of their company. There's people that are doing corporate and commercial work. There's people that are building tools and software to sit alongside their production arms. And then there's people who are just being really clever about the types of production that they take on and really right-sizing that to their company. So that feels possible. I also heard conversations where it was like, if I don't get a commission this week, then my company is at great risk of falling over in the coming months. So that's just heartbreaking and devastating as well. And all the more reason we need to keep pushing forward with these conversations and supporting each other.
Yeah, and that foundation of community that can feel so lost when we start to have this bigger concept of what industry is and business is, but it's a community populating that business, which is so easy to lose sight of.
I was at Screen Forever off the back of the Women in Screen AI workshop that was run by Jessie Hughes and Kate Armstrong Smith.
It sounded pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people who were at Screen Forever had been at the AI workshop as well. There were over 80 women there from the screen industry.
Which is interesting about Screen Forever conversations around AI this year. It didn't feel like we were battling whether it was upon us and we needed to accept it. Acceptance is there. It's just that question around how do we maintain our humanity within that, and obviously where the ethical boundaries are.
The first morning was really about what's possible with AI, and we ran through the entire spectrum from development to production to release and marketing, post-production included, and just looking at some of the tools and seeing examples of work that has been done out there in the real world, which in many ways was mind-blowing for a lot of people, but also brought up so many feelings. And by the time we got to lunch, we had a few minutes just to debrief, and it ended up in a conversation where everyone was just raising concerns like, what does this mean for me and the environment and IP and creatives and the future of the workforce and the ability to train people to come up underneath us and learn the skills that AI will now potentially take over. And there was this huge tension in the room. But what we landed on is that is kind of the point. Like, we're at a
Mhm.
point in time where either we can let this go and stay out of the conversation and let the tech bros take over the future of our industry, or we can have these conversations transparently. We can raise our concerns. We can put our own policies in place about how we want to use AI and where our own boundaries are, and then instill them into our personal use and into our productions rather than just choosing yes or no. It's no longer a yes or no question. It's a gray area where we have to make really specific decisions and adjust as we go. So I'm really interested now in exploring policy, not just at a national level where government has the ability to influence these tech companies and how they integrate their work into Australia, but how on a production I can have an AI use policy that sets the tone for what I believe is the correct and ethical use of AI, and then have that discussion with individual departments and create a project that we're proud of that is human driven.
That's really interesting. As a story consultant and a script consultant, I read so much work, and I would argue that the greater percentage of people are using AI. Sometimes it's really identifiable, sometimes it's not. You can feel where the balance isn't right. I will have to say, though, I really miss human error. And when I see a spelling mistake, or I see a break in rhythm, or I see something completely unexpected, those little surprises are far less common than they used to be. And it's really made me think about what voice is and how do we preserve that within our work. So to anyone out there in the creative process using AI, I just advocate always let that last pass be yours, because those beautiful sort of breaks in monotony or something that feels less homogenized and does feel that beautifully humanly imperfect element, reach for that, because that is voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, the appeal of AI is in the ability to improve efficiencies of processes so that we can spend more time on the creative work, because I have always been someone who's come from that creative background and I love what that human voice is. So, I created a tool for Screen Forever about how to do your research and find the best meetings for your project. And it really helped a lot of people to plan their conference and hopefully get more out of it than they would have been able to do themselves alone. But then I ended the week on Saturday night at the ACS, the Cinematographers Society National Awards, which were held here in Adelaide. And to go back to my roots in camera department and see the phenomenal work that was up on screen that was so human led and human driven and beautiful. Like, it did have that quality that wasn't perfect digital. And the Millie Award, the best work of the year nationally, was won by Bob Newen for a project that was shot on 35 millimeter film, to the point where they actually had to create their own post processes because those services no longer exist in Australia. And it was stunning. So I don't think we're in danger of losing craft, but I think we're in danger of people coming through having the opportunity to experiment with those craft tools and potentially have those pathways that a lot of the cinematographers in a room did get when they were coming through.
Yeah, and I heard a little bit of discussion at Screen Forever, or speculation that AI is gonna push us through a passage where we maybe lean into technology too much, but we'll come back to our humanity. We'll come back to what humans can produce. It might swing us back the other way. Kirsty, you were pitching a feature at Screen Forever. Where are things sitting in the feature space?
This has been a huge conversation as well, especially with the National Cultural Policy submissions coming up. And we obviously had Kate Seprovich and her episode last week talking with Avon about all of the difficulty she had in releasing her film Proclivitus last month and getting it in front of audiences. And then last week, while we were at Screen Forever, Nick Hayes, who's the CEO of Independent Cinemas Australia, released his Made Not Seen report, which he created in a personal capacity. It's an analysis of Australian box office and what's going on at the moment. And what came out of it is there are still people going to the cinema, but there has been a real lack of support in getting Australian films into the cinema, building the conversation around them, spending that money on P&A. There was a comment when his report was released that nothing kills the magic of cinema faster than a 10 a.m. Tuesday screening being the only available session for a local release. Yeah, go back and listen to that conversation with Kate. It basically was what everyone was talking about in the feature space of how do we get our films seen and not just made. And there's such a strong link with the necessity of a theatrical release in features because of that 40% offset and that lack of private investment as well. There were conversations going back to 10BA days and how there was so much more local private investment in film.
Gosh, I don't know. It feels like we're at such a precipice of change, that equally positive slash daunting place to be. Thinking back to what you said about facing a 10 a.m. session on a Tuesday, I mean, that's such a daunting prospect for a producer. What's the feeling in the producing sector around keeping those spirits up? Like, what's the attitude of producers at the moment, and how has that changed, or how is the uncertainty feeling?
There are a lot of people who are feeling daunted at the moment. But what we tried to address in the producer skill set session was really where the opportunities are. And the common theme with the panelists was that to survive in this industry, what you need is that sense of entrepreneurialism. And to me, that comes back to business models. Like I went into the conference really positive because the project I'm pitching feels like a really strong business case. And I basically started at the point of, okay, if I was building this as a startup, how would I find that audience? How would I make them want to go and see it? How do we ensure that the product is something that they want to talk about and tell their friends about? And so I think if you come back to less of an industry perspective and more of an individual perspective, how do you put yourself in a position to have the best chance possible of succeeding? And listening back through all the conversations we've had on the podcast over the last year has been really helpful because I feel like we're getting little glimpses of the future, and being able to pick and choose the elements that suit our project or our business and wrap that together has been really exciting for me.
Yeah, that entrepreneurial spirit is the very thing that drives our industry. There were quite a number of conversations where people were identifying that they're just done with hearing what's wrong, and it is moving to a solutions focused perspective and looking at what we can do, accepting realities that might not be favorable, but then what can we do from here, which feels like a positive sort of uptick for the industry.
Should we get into the awards? My 5-year-old had his first sports day the next day, so I came home to be there with him. But you were at the awards.
I was. I had the pleasure of getting up on stage with the wrong set of glasses on, so I could barely open my phone to read the speech. But I had the pleasure of accepting the award for the best online series for Moonbird, which I EP'd when I was at SBS. Beautiful First Nation story. It was such an impressive feat to take cast and crew out to this remote island in the Bass Strait. But that was Moonbird by She Oak Films, which is Catherine Petman's company, and Criticana Productions, Adam Thompson and Nathan Maynard. Susie Jones, I was Commissioner of the Year. Everybody loves Susie, a real industry favourite and very deserved award. Such an impressive practitioner, but doing the work with kindness and respect, I think, is what industry really respects about Susie. Big award winners for Production Business of the Year, and also winning the Screen Export Award was Jungle Entertainment. I've known that team for a very long time. They were sort of kicking around as I was starting my career. And I was saying to Chloe Rickard, one of the partners in Jungle, that was really lovely to see them get up there as three friends who'd started this business together, and they're still at it, winning really well earned awards. Was really, really lovely to see. Drama series, season 3 of The Newsreader. Joe Werner and Emma Freeman were up there accepting the award. I love Emma Freeman. Every time I run into that human being, I'm so impressed by how unapologetically Emma Freeman remains Emma Freeman. Shout out to Emma Freeman and everything that she does and every piece of work that she touches. I'm looking forward to seeing Dustfall, and I heard it won the Audience Award at Series Mania.
And Kangaroo won Best Feature Film for Brindle Films and Bunya Productions as well, which was great to see.
It's a beautiful film.
So there's a couple of key pieces of research and policy that have just been released or are coming up at the moment that I think are important to touch on. Screen Australia and Olsberg SBI have just released their PICA report, which is the Production Infrastructure and Capacity Analysis report. And there were a lot of risks and structural issues that came up in that report, from skills shortages to the aging crew base that we have, that pressure on mid-career pathways and people leaving the industry rather than continuing through, and what might be the causes of that. And then looking at some of those bottlenecks around infrastructure as well, whether that's sound stages, post-production, VFX. So a lot came out in that report. We'll put a link in the show notes for anyone who's interested in reading it in more detail. But I think what is possible and where we need to take agency is that flows on to the new National Cultural Policy Survey, and the community consultation is happening right now. So, Loani, what is the National Cultural Policy and why should we care?
Yeah, I mean, national cultural policy really comes down to so much of what was being discussed at Screen Forever in those lunchlines around what stories do we want to tell? What are we actually protecting? So, the Australian government is developing a new national cultural policy to shape the future of the creative and cultural sector, building on the current cultural policy called Revive, a place for every story, a story for every place. And they're looking at addressing the 5 pillars, or building upon the 5 pillars that were in Revive. So, we have First Nations first, a place for every story, centrality of the artist, strong cultural infrastructure, and engaging the audience. There is public consultation open at the moment, which closes on the 24th of May. So, really crucial. You can submit a very short statement. I believe you can also submit video content, but it closes on Sunday, the 24th of May.
We'll put the link in the show notes for where you can submit. But I think this is really important. If you were someone who was having those conversations at Screen Forever, if there's something that needs to change in the industry, this is how we actually put our voices forward to government. And I know that's something that we always hesitate to do, or we say, what's going to change anyway? How can this possibly have an impact? But the more we are visible and transparent about what the industry needs, then the more chance there is of someone actually doing something about it. We are the people that are going to shape the future of this industry. And if you're not sure how to frame it or what we should be talking about, I would encourage you to go to Kate Seprovich's Australians in Cinema Substack. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. She was our guest last week talking about why she thinks the national cultural policy is so important. And she's raising some incredible questions specifically around the feature space that you can talk to. But there are greater issues in the wider sector as well. So come at it from your perspective and share what you think needs to change.
And encouraging to see that they're holding to building on First Nations first, because certainly from my perspective, we can't have a conversation around what Australian identity is, what Australian culture is within story, if we don't first address First Nations stories. Deirdre Brennan from Screen Australia was encouraging everybody to submit, and it doesn't matter how polished or ill polished you think your ideas and your voice matter. So, to contribute to that conversation, super important. It would be exciting to see what comes out of it. What's in production this month, Kirsty?
I think the theme of production this month is big stars in Australia. There is so much inbound international production and a lot of big names on the ground. In Queensland, there's Jake Gyllenhaal and Kevin Costner shooting Honeymoon with Harry. Sydney Sweeney is on the Gold Coast with Gundam, I think it's pronounced. Chris Hemsworth is doing Cockroach in New South Wales. Mark Wahlberg is in Sydney for The Big Fix. Just massive names all shooting here in Australia. And I think that comes back to that conversation that we were having at Screen Forever is, what are we as an industry?
Yeah, are we a service hub and making the work, which is such a big part of the screen economy? But the other side of that is, are we actually keeping the value of what we make? It's a tricky conversation because we can't lose it and don't want to disregard the importance of those inbounds, keeping our industry afloat. But then how else do we look at exploring what our value is and stories that we make? There's always so much conversation around how sustainable that is and how we are at the mercy of those internationals bringing that production in. But it really does serve, particularly particularly in places like Queensland, such a foundation of our livelihood. There's so many cast and crew who are able to sustain careers because of those inbounds. It's just that other piece that's missing on how do we keep telling our own stories.
It's that balance. And that ties into the question of where is the money coming from as well. Even a lot of our own projects these days, the finance comes from overseas and we don't necessarily retain control over the productions that are our own. So it's about building an industry where the long term value, at least a big portion of it, does sit here with Australian creators and Australian companies.
I mean, there were conversations at Screen Forever about what happens if we take on that distribution risk. So if we absorb what the international partners have been taking on in distribution and start to own more of our stories, then what does that mean practically? Does that mean that we're looking at fewer productions to be able to take on that risk? We're already in an era of less commissions. Does that scale back even further so that we can own our own stories and then, to your point, Kirsty, see that long term value come back into the industry and be able to then develop more, then commission more? There might be a little transition period in there to contend with.
The international market as a whole is going through this period of extreme change, and we are seeing shifts happen. We saw this month that Kidscreen was cancelled, so that's the end of the long-running kids market, and that feels really, really sad for the children's industry.
It's an interesting one because I don't think it's necessarily about demand. We know kids are watching content and how they're consuming that content might have shifted, and the commissioning landscape around kids might have shifted. It just makes me think that, thank gosh, in Australia, we still have commissioners who are willing to back kids' content, and we need more of it. But thank gosh that still exists. And as a mum, I really hope that something shifts in that landscape because it's so crucial when you get those really great shows that really speak to kids but speak to their parents. And again, I know we talk about Bluey a lot. It's such a perfect example of shows that reflect where kids are at and how smart they are, how savvy they are, how worldly they are. So anyway, I don't think it's a reflection of demand. I think it's possibly a reflection of the commissioning landscape around kids.
That commissioning landscape is still really tough in Australia for kids, though. It feels like the only place to go at the moment is the ABC. And when they're looking at a new version of Little Lunch and a new version of Bananas in Pajamas, we're not seeing a lot of new kids' shows or kids' IP coming through the pipeline. And we just need more opportunities for kids outside of one broadcaster.
I mean, in more positive news, Screen Australia announced $20.4 million worth of production and development funding across 91 narrative projects. And that included the first project through its new short film production funding program, which is exciting.
Yeah, we have seen short films really come back, and several state agencies also reinvesting in short film. And even at the Gold Coast Film Festival closing night, Actor Proof announced their finalists. So this is 3 projects that each receive a $65,000 production and development package to support proof of concept films that will hopefully go on to features.
Yeah, it's really exciting, forward thinking initiative that also looks at the release strategy around those films in terms of how that funding breaks down, quite heavily weighted into that strategy.
Yeah, so congratulations to Deadline, The Water Tank, and Tick Tick Tick, who were the recipients of that initiative. And one of those teams, Deadline, includes Lachlan and Austin McFarlane, who have been previous guests on the podcast.
That's been a busy month, Kirsty, but some really interesting points of conversation popping up across Screen Forever and the industry.
Yeah, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of all the conversations I've been part of in the last week, but please keep having them. And this Thursday, the 7th of May at 8:30 Eastern Standard Time, we'll be having an Instagram live conversation to talk through this episode and any of the conversations that you had at Screen Forever. Robbie, Loani, Avon and I will all be there, and we'd love you to join us and have a chat. That's 8:30 on Thursday the 7th of May at We Interrupt Podcast on Instagram. And coming up next week, we have our first ever video episode. So you'll still be able to tune into the first part on audio, but then we're switching to a screen share with David Nord from Pathfinder, and he's going to be walking me through how to use Claude as a producer. This is a really in-depth episode that I learned so much from about creating those production pathway efficiencies and choosing how to set up your AI platform to do what you want to without pushing into the areas that you're not comfortable with. So very much worth tuning in for.
Thanks, Kirsty. Nice to chat.
Thanks so much, Loani. Now back to your regular programming. We Interrupt This broadcast is recorded on the unceded lands of the
Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Turrbal and Yuggera people,
the Yugambeh language people, and the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we acknowledge them as the traditional custodians and first storytellers of these regions.
Always was, always will be.